So this is my message and question to truthers who do their own research. Why investigate so many issues and events while ignoring the most important one? I never understood why so many people investigate so many particular questions. Conspiracy theories is what they're often called. But the one that has shaped the entire world and gave rise to Western civilization itself, that one is literally consequential to everyone alive today. It's so important, I'm not exaggerating here, that the sum total events in all of human history approach irrelevancy when you compare them to this. Now, before I get into this, I need to ask you to ignore the fact that most people place this one in a particular category. I submit to you that that category may have been applied to change our thinking about this particular event, just like the term conspiracy theory and other terms like that are applied to influence public perception of a particular theory or event. Labels don't change truth or history, and the truthfulness of what I'm about to tell you did not change when the term religion was applied to this particular event. I also need to submit to you that the truthfulness of this is in no way, shape, or form altered by the behavior of people who may already believe this. 2 + 2 = 4. And that's true no matter how rude, arrogant, foolish, or abusive a crowd of math professors actively professing that 2 + 2 = 4 might be. Truth isn't changed by who believes it. I'm talking about Jesus, the Jesus described in the Bible. Specifically, the death and resurrection of Jesus. I was raised a Christian, and shortly after becoming an adult, I studied this in depth to see what the historical case was for the basic tenet of what I believed. Could a case be made for Jesus' resurrection? It's been a while since I studied this material in detail, but I do remember a lot. During and shortly after Jesus' life, there was little news competing with him. The Roman Empire had, for one of the first times, if not the first time in history, created something very near world peace through its military dominance. So with little else going on, the equivalent to a media back then zeroed in on Jesus. I remember learning that there was something like well over 100 books written about Jesus during and shortly after his time on earth. And writing books back then was a big deal. It was much harder, and therefore a lot more rare today. I'm going to guess here that might be the equivalent to 500 books in today's world, where anyone can write and publish an ebook. Jesus is probably the most studied historical figure in the world. Secular historians contest nothing meaningful about the biblical account of Jesus in the Bible other than the supernatural events. And by this I mean that what the Bible says about Jesus is pretty much accepted as true, as written. There might be some who debate whether on a particular day he rode a camel or he rode a donkey, but the only real meaningful disputes between the Bible and secular historians revolve around the supernatural events. So as the Bible says, Jesus was executed in public by several Roman soldiers who were probably among the most experienced and therefore the most proficient executors in the world. And he was executed by crucifixion. Secular historians do not contest this. Jesus was buried in a tomb sealed shut by rolling an approximately 2-ton, probably wheel-shaped boulder down a slope to cover and seal the entrance to his tomb. Secular historians do not contest this. Those who arranged for the execution of Jesus were concerned that the disciples might steal his body and claim he had risen from the dead. So a guard was placed in front of the tomb. Now here, it's important to note, a Roman guard was not a single person. The term guard referred to a unit of soldiers in the Roman army. For this discussion purposes, it's probably better to use the word platoon. It's not known how many soldiers were in this particular platoon, and my memory may not be perfectly accurate, but we do know it was probably a Roman guard, which would have been very unlikely to have fewer than 50 soldiers. It could have been a temple guard, in which case it could have been as few as 12 of the most heavily armed, toughest soldiers in history guarding that tomb from Jesus' disciples, who were fishermen and other tradesmen and who had no combat experience at all. 3 Roman soldiers would have been overkill to protect a dead body behind a 2-ton boulder. Secular historians do not contest this. The Roman soldiers faced death as a punishment if Jesus' body went missing under their watch. Secular historians don't contest this. Either way, Jesus is known to have been executed and placed in a heavily guarded tomb. Secular historians don't contest this either. Over the next 45 days or so, many people believed beyond any doubt that they saw Jesus alive, heard him speak, interacted with him, ate with him. On one occasion, over 500 people believed beyond any doubt they saw Jesus alive, a little over a month after his very public execution. Secular historians do not contest this. What they do contest is the accuracy of Jesus' hundreds of alibis, all placing him alive after his execution. I don't know how many alibis it takes for most reasonable court systems around the world to corroborate someone's presence at a given place and time. I know one alibi is often enough. 2 or 3 should certainly be true to rule out any issues. Maybe 4 or even 5 might be required under extraordinarily unusual circumstances. But over 500 alibis on one occasion, all with the same story, plus all the other earlier ones, many of whom he ate with, spent time with, his family. His disciples who'd been living with him for a few years immediately prior to his execution as well, they were alibis. Many of these alibis ended up accepting death, often brutal deaths, rather than recanting their witness testimony. In fact, I have yet to encounter an account of even just one alibi of Jesus' resurrection ever recanting his testimony. In fact, these alibis are so rock solid that secular historians who don't want to deal with a resurrected Jesus in their personal lives have come up with some rather interesting stories to explain away his alibis. One is the twin theory. It states Jesus had an unknown identical twin which nobody knew about, who, when he heard of his brother's execution, came back and used his similar appearance to impersonate Jesus. I am married to an identical twin. When I first met her and her sister, I couldn't tell them apart, but as anyone who knows a set of twins can tell you, that doesn't last. Especially when you consider that Jesus necessarily had knowledge and shared memories his twin could not have had. His twin also would have had to have maimed himself in all the right spots. Besides this and similar theories, they fail when we realize that all the Hebrew and Roman rulers who wanted Jesus dead, all they had to do was to produce his body. It had only been a few days. What is probably the most popular attempt at explaining away the resurrection is the theory that Jesus swooned on the cross. It states Jesus entered a death-like state, and the most proficient executioners in the world simply messed up and declared him dead when he was only unconscious. Jesus, presumed dead, was buried in a tomb without effort to stop the necessarily profuse bleeding from a living body, much less receiving any medical treatment. Despite all of his injuries, loss of blood, dehydration, and everything else, for 3 days, he later woke up. Somehow the 2-ton boulder was removed, and the guards were overpowered but remained alive and uninjured, and were no longer present at the tomb. So he could exit the tomb and remain in the vicinity of the tomb for some period of time. Ignoring the medical absurdity of this, we have the following issue. The executioners were well-developed, very professional individuals. They weren't new at this. They did this a lot in Rome. Their professional diligence and caution prompted them to pierce Jesus' body in the side to confirm his death. And they did confirm Jesus was in fact dead. The soldiers guarding the tomb were subject to execution if they failed to guard the tomb. Even falling asleep was punishable by death. They could not have been overpowered, and certainly would not have surrendered or allowed themselves to be overpowered without being killed first. No bribe is worth your life. Failure to guard the tomb was a literal death sentence in the Roman army. Jesus' poor physical condition upon rescue, if he was rescued, would have been a clue that he did not actually die and supernaturally come back to life. Would the disciples have died rather than recant their belief that Jesus rose from the dead, had they known Jesus did not really die? At least 10 of the remaining 11 disciples chose death, and as I understand it, horrible deaths, rather than recant their stories. I say 10 because John's fate is not known. I don't recommend believing in the swoon theory. So this is the best some of the smartest historians could come up with to explain away the resurrection of Jesus. After having almost 2,000 years of practice, this is it. How many alibis does it take to convince you? Is several hundred rock-solid, consistent alibis that have withstood 2,000 years of rather brutal academic attack enough? Jesus rose from the dead. The only way to explain away all the alibis is to concoct and believe a conspiracy theory so great the most delusioned conspiracy theorist could not imagine it contained any truth. This is how far you have to go to have a reality which recognizes all the undisputed facts and contains a Jesus who stayed dead. Jesus cannot be a lunatic or a liar. Lunatics and liars don't rise from the dead. He absolutely cannot be a good teacher or just a nice man. Good teachers and nice men don't spend years of their life telling people that they are in fact God. And the only way to avoid the lake of fire after Judgment Day is by trusting him. Also, history has not one good teacher who came back from the dead, much less ones with hundreds of alibis to prove it. There is no other person I am aware of with such a fantastic story of his resurrection, much less one that remains unscathed after 2,000 years of attack. Jesus is who he told us he is, and he can and do what he promised. Our lives are short and may end at any moment. Imagine yourself wherever you end up in 100,000 years. What else in this life would matter to you then? Will you care about some election, the outcome of a war in your country, or some personal achievement? It stands to reason that your only concern about what happens in this life will revolve around whether or not you, your loved ones, and others got rescued from our fate in the lake of fire. If you will eventually not care about the things of this life, why procrastinate on abandoning our cares? Nobody gets to stay here forever. Saving us is something Jesus does to us and for us. All we do is consent. Again, if this is true, the sum total of events in all of human history are almost irrelevant compared to the importance of this. If you're new to Bible reading, start with the book of John. That's the Gospel of John, not John's 1 through 3. Nothing wrong with them. I just think you should start with the Gospel of John. Then move to Romans. I'm going to put a link for more details in case you want a more in-depth examination of the facts surrounding the resurrection of Jesus and who he is and why he is necessarily who he is and can't be anyone else, a good teacher or a lunatic or just a prankster. I'm also going to link what I would call a salvation video that instructs you on how Jesus intends to save us, on his intent for coming to the earth and dying on the cross. Jesus is Lord.